It's great to be here, and I am suffering from a slight sense of déjà vu, because this precise day last week, I was here speaking to the Guildford Diocesan Conference. And what's even more freaky is that for the first time in that, I come here often, and for the first time at that conference, I stayed in a completely new bit of Swanwick I'd never stayed in before. And this week, I'm 2 doors down from where I was last week, which is just very weird. So if I suddenly start talking about a completely different subject, it's because I've slipped back through time and I'm talking to another conference. But I won't, because we're talking this week, as you know, about discipleship and the importance of discipleship. And what I want to do with you is to give some time to reflect on the theme of disciple in the New Testament, particularly in the Gospels, and what it meant. Now, you will probably know, when you had a look at the theme, that actually this is actually an impossible task. And it's worth us just stating at the start that it is an impossible task, because we probably would need about 2 months in order to do the subject justice. The theme of discipleship throughout the Gospels is such an important one, and it's finely nuanced, and it has different representations in the different Gospels. And so therefore, on one level, what we're just going to be doing in today and tomorrow morning is skimming the surface. So if you're sitting there thinking, but she hasn't said, you should see the list of hundreds of things that I didn't say, that I cut out while I was preparing for this session. So there's loads that we're not going to cover. The other thing it's worth bearing in mind at the start is that actually, in order to be able to say anything of any value, you've also got to say quite a lot of obvious things. And I'm a big fan of saying the obvious, because the trouble is, if you try and say the new and the interesting all the time, actually what you end up doing is being a little bit bemusing and confusing. And so if you think, I know this already, I know you know it already, but nevertheless you need to be able to put the what you know already into a framework in order to make it make sense. And sometimes, actually, if you get it right, I've no idea if I will, but sometimes actually putting the obvious in a good framework is a really helpful thing to have done, even if you don't do other things. So let's see how we go, see where we get to. The other thing I just want to draw your attention to, which for me is a really, really important thing, is that the purpose of you being here, and again, you know this, but it's worth just reminding yourself of it at the start of the conference. So the purpose of you being here is giving yourselves the chance to do some creative thinking, to have some space, and in the case of my sessions this afternoon and tomorrow morning, to gather around the scriptures together. And the reason why I say that is that for me, the really important thing, when I will have succeeded over the course of the next few hours, is if you've started to go off and think your own thoughts. If you start to follow your own nose and say, oh, that makes me wonder about this, and I wonder if I kind of chase that down where I would get to, and then you might just start rifling through the Gospels and say, but what about that passage and how does it fit in? As far as I'm concerned, that's absolutely fine by me. In fact, if you don't listen to a word I say, but think your own thoughts, then that still is absolutely fine by me. It'd be kind of nice if you could listen to a couple of words, you know, I've prepared a while, but actually if you do get caught up in your own thoughts and go off thinking your thoughts, then that's great, and I'd be really enthusiastic to hear where you get to at the end of your thinking journeys. We'll have time both today and tomorrow to have conversation together. We are quite a lot of people, so it's going to be quite a challenge to have the conversation together, but I do hope that to be able to hear back where your thoughts have taken you and what you're going to be thinking about as we're exploring this thing together. So, what we're going to be doing is doing some biblical reflections. I forget what my title was, but you'll see I've ratcheted it down from, I forget what it is, Discipleship in the Bible. It sounded rather definitive to me, to some reflections on discipleship in the Bible. Follow our noses and see where we get to. So some preliminary thoughts before we get going on disciples. You probably, as I have done, have been reading a fair amount on discipleship and disciples. People have been writing editorial comments, little columns in various church newspapers, observations in blogs about the nature of discipleship. And I wanted to start by just being clear about what I think the whole notion of discipleship is. I was recently reading an article And I was clearly getting quite irritated because my husband came into the room and went, "Are you all right?" And I went, "Yeah, I'm just shouting at the article, it's fine." And the reason why I was shouting at the article was because it's kept on all the way through the article talking about the metaphor of discipleship. And to start with, I took it well. And then by the end of the article, I was going, "It's not a metaphor," which was the point at which my husband came in to find out if I was all right. And let me just be clear about images and metaphors and the importance of images and metaphors, and the light goes out as we do so. And now they've come back on again. Oh, it's a roller coaster of enlightenment and disenlightenment. You think your way back to English language lessons, if you can think your way back to there. Two images, there's lots of other images that we use in language, but two of the most important are similes and metaphors. Similes are where something is like something else, and the connection is obvious and clear. You don't have to work hard to work at looking at this, the connection between the thing and the thing that it's like. So you might say, she roared like a lion. That's a simile. So she may not roar precisely right like a lion, but actually the connection between the roaring and the lionness of the noise that she made is sufficiently clear that that's a simile. A metaphor is something which doesn't have the word as or like in it, and it's very much more suggestive. So you might say, she bottled up her anger. That would be a metaphor. Because she hadn't been roaring enough like a lion. I use my metaphor advisedly. And the idea of bottling up is, of course, there is no way that you can put anger in a bottle. It's not a kind of exact connection. But the point about a metaphor is that as you make the connection, it's the work that you do between the thing and the thing that you're trying to connect that gives you meaning. It is, incidentally, what Jesus is doing in a lot of his parables. He puts the kingdom next to this, and then says, well, work out what you think is the connection between the kingdom and this. You know, the kingdom is like yeast. It's like mustard seed. It's like treasure. It's like the pearl in the field. It's like a landowner. And you go, I beg your pardon? The trouble is we don't, because actually we're so familiar with it's like that we go, yeah, the kingdom is like yeast, a mustard seed, a landowner, and we don't actually register it. But that's what's going on with metaphors. Now, the really important thing is discipleship is neither a simile nor is it a metaphor, because actually it was a reality. And the really important thing to bear in mind is that when we're talking about discipleship, we are talking about a first century reality. It describes a reality that in the first century Judaism would have been readily recognized by anybody who lived within a first century Jewish context. If you said to somebody, so-and-so is a disciple of Gamaliel or Yohanan ben Zakkai or any one of the great Jewish rabbis, they wouldn't have said it was a figure of speech, they wouldn't have said it was a simile, they wouldn't have said it was a metaphor, they would have said it described an actual relationship. So what we're doing when we are reflecting on the theme of discipleship are two really important things. The first is that we are recognizing that we don't have master discipleship relationships anymore. They were real, we don't have them. You know, you don't see rabbis wandering around very often these days with disciples following. So I'm just trying to get my mic a little bit further away. Does that sound a bit better if it's a bit? No, it's still... How about that? No? Up a bit? Down a bit? How about that? Is that... No, it's still not better, is it? I'll stop fiddling in a moment. But anyway, you don't normally see rabbis and their disciples tootling around in groups in 21st century England very often these days. So the first thing we need to recognize is that it was a reality in the first century. It's not a reality in the 21st century. So the first thing we have to do is to do a task of translation and say it is a word that resonated very strongly in the first century. It doesn't resonate strongly today. We need to do the work of bringing those two worlds together. The second thing that we need to do is to recognize that actually Jesus redefined the master-disciple relationship. So the other thing we need to do when we're doing our biblical reflections on discipleship is say, well, how did Jesus redefine the master-disciple relationship? How does it now look different? And crucially, of course, the key thing is that Jesus then went and left his disciples. There's a twist to that at the end, which we need to have a look at later on in the talk. But nevertheless, Jesus went and left the disciples. So therefore, he redefined the relationship between master and disciple. So when we're talking about discipleship, we're doing two things. Well, three things. The first thing we're doing is we're saying this is not a figure of speech. It's an actual relationship that's going on, and we need to recognize that this is an actual relationship. It's an actual relationship, second point, that made sense in the first century and makes less sense in the 21st century and needs to be reinvested with meaning in the 21st century. And third point is that actually in any case, Jesus redefined what it meant to be a disciple, and we need to work out how he redefined it in the light of what was going on in the first century. Guess what we're going to be doing in the course of the next hour or so? That's what we're exploring, and that's what I wanted to lay down for you so you get a sense of that. So, this is what we need to recognise when we're understanding discipleship. That it refers to a familiar reality from the first century, that it refers to a reality for a group of people who were Jesus' actual disciples. It's worth just lobbing in as a footnote at this point. No one can quite decide who you should say were Jesus' actual disciples. It's why I've got whether 12 or more than 12. And in reality, it depends on which gospel you're reading. If you're reading Matthew's gospel, then Matthew only talks about the 12 being Jesus' disciples until right at the very end, Matthew 28, when he then says, go and make disciples of all nations. Whereas in Mark's gospel, other people than just the 12 are called disciples. And another point which will become relevant slightly later is that as well as calling them the 12 disciples, you will remember from what Bishop Stephen said just earlier, he also called them apostles. And we need to have a look at the connection between apostles and disciples as well in Mark's gospel. So whoever the disciples were, it was a real relationship, and there was a real relationship between Jesus and these group of people. And now, as I've said, we are challenged to reinvest it with meaning now that the reality has changed. I want to give myself the liberty of just going down a little cul-de-sac for a moment before returning and doing what I've just said that I'm going to do. And the little cul-de-sac I would like to enter is Paul and the Conundrum of Paul. Some of you may be aware some of the discussions that were going on about discipleship a few months ago, where some people said, well, discipleship is not really that important in the New Testament because it's only there in the Gospels, and then it disappears from Paul, which is a proof that actually it's just a very early phenomenon and then it disappears, and we shouldn't really be investing too much of our discussion today in discipleship. Can I just say, that was another one of my shouty moments when I was reading things. I don't think they were completely correct in their reading of what's going on. And there are many, many reasons why I don't think they were completely correct, not least because the Gospels were written after Paul, which rather kind of flummoxes one part of the early argument. But I do just want to talk a little bit about Paul and his relationship to discipleship, because it is interesting, don't you think, that Paul actually doesn't use the noun disciple at all anywhere through his writings. And it's just striking that he doesn't, given that he himself was a disciple of Gamaliel. And we could spend an awfully long time scratching our heads saying, why do we think Paul doesn't use the noun disciple? And there could be all sorts of reasons why he doesn't use the noun disciple. It is just possible that for Paul, the noun is so invested with meaning because he was a disciple of Gamaliel that actually it's too difficult for him to take it over and use in his new relationship with Jesus. It could be that actually because he wasn't one of the 12, he didn't want to use a title that he then can't kind of borrow quite so easily. There's lots and lots of possible reasons about why he doesn't use the noun. It is also rather intriguing that he doesn't use the verb that is connected to the noun, which is to make disciples. And I just wanted to show you the examples of the occasions where that verb comes, because I think they're rather interesting. The first is in Matthew 13, verse 52, where he said to them, therefore every scribe who has been trained is the verb that comes from the noun disciple, who has been discipled for the kingdom of heaven, Jesus uses. So it's quite interesting that he's using it in that particular context. Matthew 27, verse 57, I think is another very interesting one. When it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who was, you would never guess the verb was there at that point, who was as someone having been discipled to Jesus. So it's not the noun used there, but there the verb. And then, of course, Matthew 28, verse 19, where the verb comes. You might notice that there is a certain similarity about the three references, the key references of the using of the verb there. And we could spend a while reflecting on it, but we haven't got the time. And in any case, it's used once in Acts, which is worth just nodding your head in the direction of. So Paul doesn't use the noun disciple, and he doesn't use the verb to make disciples. But he does use the verb manthano. In a moment, I'll show you what the noun looks like in Greek. But the verb manthano is also connected to the noun. And the verb manthano means to learn. So you've got two types of verb going on. You've got to learn and to make somebody who learns are the two types of verb. And Paul uses that verb really more than one occasion. I think there's kind of 4 or 5 occasions when he uses it. And I think it is really quite interesting to see the way in which he uses it. Ephesians 4 verse 20 is a particularly fascinating one. And since this is a cul-de-sac, we just need to wave at it, but move on. But it is just worth noting it. Note the language that he uses there. That is not the way you learned Christ. That feels to me as though he is acknowledging the existence of disciples and the nature of discipleship. He's not, because you expect him to say, that is not the way you learned about Christ, or it's not the way you learned the things of Christ or the mind of Christ. But he just says, that is not the way you learned Christ, as though it's some kind of formula that they would have understood what he's talking about. So one possibility about why Paul doesn't use the noun or the verb, disciple or to make disciples, is the same reason why he doesn't talk very much about the life of Jesus, and the same reason why he doesn't record much about the miracles, which in my view is because he assumes people know about it already, rather than because he deliberately doesn't use it. But you can't really use a strong argument from silence. So having waved at Paul, we will now move on into the Gospels. And what I want to do is, as I've said, split this into 2 parts. The first part is to say, well, what would somebody who was Jewish in the 1st century understand by the word disciple? What would it mean to them? What kind of resonances would you find for it? And we need to start with the words which we've already started to have a look at. The Greek word for disciple is mathetes, and the Latin word is discipulus. Now, something really intriguing has gone on in the popular mindset when we're talking about disciples, which I think absolutely fascinating. I've done various entirely unofficial surveys of what people think the word disciple means. You know, unofficial on the grounds that I say to them, what do you think the word disciple means? And they tell me. It's not very scientific at all. But everybody that I've ever asked, when I've said to them, what do you think the word disciple means? They say, a follower of Jesus. And it's very interesting. And they're not wrong. They're just not completely right. And that's one of the really interesting things about how culturally now you say, what is a disciple? A disciple is a follower of Jesus. Technically, it's not. Because the words mathetes and then the Latin discipulus, you will probably know already, actually means somebody who learns. What does the word disciple mean? It means a learner. How do you do your learning? You learn by following. So following is the byproduct of being a disciple. It's not the primary meaning of the word disciple, if you see the distinction. And I think it's a really important distinction and worth kind of rootling around in a little bit to get a sense about what we think it means and why it's important. Because the trouble is, if you say that being a follower, being a disciple is somebody who follows Jesus, it's kind of a single option, a single kind of a once-only option. Jesus says, will you follow me? You say yes, job's a good one. and you carry on. You know, there you are, following Jesus. You move from being not a follower to being a follower. Yea, now I am a disciple of Jesus. And you may have noticed that there can be within church congregations a certain sense of a sigh of satisfaction once you say, now I follow Jesus. It's done. The hard work's over. I've got over the hump. I'm now into the community. I can now relax. The problem is that actually that's not really what a disciple is. A disciple is somebody who is learning. And the thing is about learning, as I'm sure you all know, you never get to that stage in your life where you then can say, I've got it all now. I know it all. I have my certificate in my hand. I know everything that I could ever need to know about this particular subject. I'm sorted. I'm settled. I now need to do no more. Well, we know that, but actually, how many of our congregations sometimes feel like that? I had a conversation with someone a few years ago which has really stuck in my gut and just simply won't leave me, because I found it a very, very challenging conversation. There was a diocese, which will remain nameless, who decided to make the slightly radical decision of employing someone in their training department who was not ministerially trained, but training trained. She was a trainer. And so she had spent her professional life training teachers, business leaders, people in the NHS. She was a professional trainer. And this diocese had said, well, wouldn't it be interesting to have a professional trainer in the training role? It might have been, but she hit the most enormous culture clash and began to struggle. So she came to talk to me for some work consultancy. And she said to me, this person who has spent years and years in the training world, and I quote exactly, I don't understand. Isn't the church a learning environment? And I went, yes, no, yes, no. And she put her finger on something which was profoundly challenging, deeply disturbing, and right on the nose for our conversation this week, which is this. Is the church a discipleship environment? i.e., is it a learning environment? And her experience had been, from trying to work with people within the church, was that it was not a learning environment. And the reason why that becomes so profoundly challenging is that actually, if we're not a learning environment, we're not a discipleship environment. And what therefore does it say if you have to acknowledge that we're not a learning environment? So you can see why the conversation has haunted me for the past few years. And it seems that actually, until we can begin to redefine disciple in a much clearer way, to say we are a community that learns and learns and learns and learns, and we do it by following Jesus, that until we can kind of re-get that, kind of turn the focus, actually we will be continuing in that difficulty, that challenge that she's raising. There's something else I just want to draw your attention to here, which I think is a very important one, which those of you who are teachers will know all too well, and probably most of you will know anyway, but particularly those of you who are teachers, which is that there is a huge difference between teaching and learning. On a really, really good day, it happens once every 20 years or so. What you thought you would teach is what somebody else learns. But the vast majority of the time, what you thought you would teach is light years away from what other people learn. In fact, one of my little bugbears of the moment is that these days in education, what you have to do whenever you're going to set down a session, not this kind of session, but kind of sessions in universities, is you have to write a list of your learning outcomes. And I always want to say, well, I don't know what the learning outcomes are going to be. I can tell you what my teaching goals are going to be. Those are very clear. But my experience from doing this for 20-odd years is what I think they're going to learn is completely different from what they do actually learn. It's not bad, it just is. And actually what we learn develops not primarily through teaching. And the reason why I say that here is that one of the temptations when you're beginning to have a look at discipleship and the whole question about learning from Jesus is, you see it time and time again when people start looking at the question of learning from Jesus, is they go to Jesus' teaching. Now, Jesus' teaching is really important. Don't get me wrong, vitally important. It's one of the crucial ingredients for understanding who Jesus thought he was, what he was trying to communicate. But what we know, as we will learn all too clear tomorrow morning, is what Jesus thought he was teaching the disciples, and what the disciples learnt were not the same thing. And so just as I have the experience, it kind of makes me feel better, I have the experience, Jesus also had the experience. Jesus' learning outcomes were not always fulfilled either. But it gets you into the recognition that actually when we're talking about discipleship, we're actually talking about something that is much bigger than we often think about. Because one of the regular conversations I often have with people about discipleship is that discipleship often can boil down to your teaching agenda, what you want people to learn. And I say, as a co-author with Stephen of the Pilgrim course, that we have had what we wanted people to learn out of the Pilgrim course, but actually what they do learn is, again, very, very different from probably what we had in our minds originally when we wrote it. But equally, discipleship does not take place only through teaching. And this is where you get into this definition of what a disciple is. Because the disciples learnt, as you will remember, from Jesus' teaching. They learnt from his, the things that he did in the miracles. They learnt from the conversations that he had. They learnt from all sorts of different things. The thing that makes a disciple is somebody who learns while knocking around with Jesus. It's not about the teaching. It's 5% about the teaching. 95% of the time, it's learning by being in the presence of Jesus. And that seems to me to be kind of right at the heart of what we're doing when we're trying to define what a disciple is. Let me continue and reflect a little bit more on disciples in the first century. Early hints of disciples. And one of the interesting questions is to ask, well, where does the theme of discipleship come from? Can we trace it back earlier than the first century? You might be really intrigued to know that actually it's quite hard to trace it back earlier within Judaism, much earlier than the first century. Technically, the word disciple is never used in the Septuagint. That LXX there is the abbreviation for Septuagint, and the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew. So you might look for the Greek word disciple in the Old Testament to see where it comes. Interestingly, it barely comes in the Old Testament. But having said that, it might be barely there, but I think the concept is there, and it's worth just kind of looking at the concept, because I think it's quite an interesting one. The first place to notice the concept of discipleship in the Old Testament is in the schools of the prophets. You may remember the schools of the prophets. They're the slightly wacky groups who you pop up in 1 Kings. There's a great story of one of the schools of the prophets where one of the sons of the prophets wants to go and grab the king's attention. So he went to one of the other members of the schools of the prophets and said, "Hit me." Do you remember the story? And he declined to hit him, so he went off and he was eaten by a lion, I seem to remember. Anyway, odd story, but something like that. But what's interesting about the schools of the prophets is clearly that there were groups of people who were around key figures. And we do know that Elijah and Elisha had people who were gathered around them. They weren't called disciples, but they looked quite like, to our modern eye, like disciples. There is a Hebrew word which could translate as disciple, but interestingly, the Greek doesn't translate it as disciple when you translate from the Hebrew into the Greek. And Isaiah 8 verse 16, I think, is a really interesting example of this, where Isaiah says, "Bind up the testimony, seal the teaching among my disciples." And the Hebrew word there is limud, which is connected to the Hebrew word for learn. So seal it among the people who have learned from me. So what's quite interesting there is you've got this group who are clearly preserving the teaching of Isaiah, which gives you some kind of insight into the nature of discipleship. It also occurs in Isaiah 50 verse 4, "Morning by morning he wakens my ear to listen as those who are taught." You might translate that as those who are disciples. just to finish the Old Testament picture, you might be interested to know that within rabbinic writing, if you were to say somebody is a disciple of a Hebrew speaker, you would say they're a Talmud, so they're connected to the limud. You wouldn't use another word for them. So, there's schools of the prophets, that kind of idea that there were kind of gatherings around the prophets. The wisdom teaching is, of course, predicated on there being something like a school of learning, a school of disciples. And then you begin to grow into Greek culture. And one of the interesting arguments is that the idea of there being a connection between a master and the people who learn from them actually comes in from Greek thinking and then imprinted itself on Hebrew thinking, which is just an interesting thing to observe. Because the word mathetes began to be used in Greek thinking for those who followed a particular philosopher. So if you were a follower of Plato or if you were a follower of Aristotle, you would be described as their mathetes. And it's possible that that actually kind of was brought into the Hebrew way of thinking, which is just interesting to observe. So, what do we know so far? The first thing that we can kind of learn, therefore, about discipleship in the first century is that a disciple's relationship to their master was the primary means of learning in first century Judaism. After you got past the age of 12, if you were going to learn anything else more, you would go to a master and learn to be their disciple. So before then, you would learn in Bet Sefer or synagogues. And what would happen is you would go there and you would learn Torah. But after the age of 12, if you were going to go on and do further learning, you would be associated with a master. You would become a disciple who was particularly associated with a master. So, the first thing that we can do in terms of a definition of a disciple is that a disciple is not someone who just learns generally. They're not just kind of picking up nuggets of information here, there, and everywhere. A disciple is somebody who learns from a specific master. They are associated with a specific master. There's more than that, though, of course. The second thing to recognize is that the form of Jewish teaching, the form of Jewish learning that took place with the rabbi and the disciple, was not a transfer of ideas. And at this point, I have to restrain myself from having a little rant about the modern educational system and how we seem to have gone back to almost entirely a transfer of ideas model rather than something else. Because for me, real learning happens not by transferring ideas, but actually opening up a world of thinking, saying these are the connections that you can make, these are the ways in which you can view the world, this is the way in which we can view things. And so what's really interesting is that there was no evidence that the rabbis taught their pupils the words of Torah. They didn't kind of teach them by rote. The implication seems to have been that they knew them by the age of 12 in their entirety. So it's worth recognizing that they knew these ideas already. The point about having a rabbi is that the rabbi taught you how to view the world. The rabbi taught you the way in which you saw the world. So the idea of being a disciple of a rabbi is the rabbi imprinted his view of the world onto the disciple so that they could see the world through his eyes. And it seems to me that there's actually something really quite important going on there when we're beginning to think about discipleship. Too often, I think, we try and teach the transfer of ideas model of discipleship rather than seeing the world as Jesus saw it. And for me, one of the interesting questions is, assuming that we are going to be communities in which discipleship is really important, in which we're trying to kind of capture the essence of discipleship, what would it be like? What would our discipleship guidelines be like? What would our discipleship courses be like if they were predicated on teaching us to see the world like Jesus sees the world? What would they look like? How would it be different if we kind of saw discipleship in those kind of ways? So, it's not a transfer of ideas, but an imprinting of a way of seeing the world. So a disciple is, as we've established already, someone who learns from the master. someone who sees the world from the perspective of the master. And you see this coming through very, very clearly in a lot of the rabbinic writings. So the reason why it's really important to know who this rabbi learnt with is that you will immediately know how he sees the world. You may be familiar with the idea that there are different schools of rabbinic thinking at the time of Jesus. If you were a follower of Rabbi Hillel, you would see the world in this way. If you were a follower of Rabbi Shammai, you would see the world in this way. It's why Paul tells us that he learnt from Gamaliel, so we can locate him in a rabbinic school. We know how he starts to see the world. So there's something about seeing the world which is important, I think, in discipleship. The other really important thing, which for me is kind of a vitally key thing for understanding discipleship, is that disciples learnt primarily by asking questions, by exploring things and discussing. They didn't learn by sitting down and reading stuff. And you can see it even in the Gospels, but you see it regularly all the way through the Mishnah and the Talmud, which is that the way in which learning takes place is a student would say, "Rabbi, can you tell me this?" And then they'd say, "But I don't understand," and the rabbi would explain again, and then they'd have a conversation, and then they'd come at it from another perspective. I don't know if any of you have ever spent a long time in the company of rabbis. I lived for 6 months in Israel and had a really interesting experience learning in the company of rabbis. And one of the really bemusing things that happens when you spend a long time in the company of rabbis is that, say there's 3 of you in the room, 2 of them are rabbis and there's you, and you're having a conversation. You'll establish what this person thinks, and you'll establish what that person thinks, and then halfway through the conversation, they'll suddenly change their view, apparently, and start arguing something else. And on a couple of occasions I said, "What? I don't understand what's going on. I thought you thought this." And they said, a really important part of rabbinic discussion is you cannot have a discussion until all the views are present in the room. If there aren't enough people present in the room to present all the views, then you have to start doing it yourself. And so what they do is they start kind of taking other positions until all the views are present and all the views have been aired, and once all the views have been aired, then the proper perspective on the world can be held. And it seems to me there is something really vital in discipleship about becoming communities that are really good at asking questions, that are good at asking really good questions rather than dumb questions. You know, the questions that actually get you into truth, questions that actually help you see things from a different perspective, but questions always which help you to see the world from the perspective of Jesus. There seems to be something there, I think, which is vitally important. How do we become communities of discussion, exploring and learning? I am fully aware of the irony of me saying this while I'm standing up here talking at you while you're all sitting there quiet. You're not going to be quiet forever. But there is, I think, something quite important there in understanding the nature of a disciple. So a disciple, a first-century disciple, was someone who asked really good questions, a good questioner, a good discusser. And connected to that, someone who engages in lively discussion in order to understand the worldview of the master. Again, it's not a transfer of ideas model. It's about being able to see the world through the eyes of the master, of the rabbi. The final question that I have been asked this question so often that I felt the need just to drop it in at this particular point. Those of you who are aware of this question will know where I'm going, but let me explain it for those of you who don't know. It became very popular kind of 5 years ago or so, it might even be slightly longer than that, to talk about disciples as people who need to be covered in the dust of the master. You find it, I'm going to show you a quote from Rob Bell in Velvet Elvis. He quoted it quite extensively. People like John Ortberg. There are a number of people from the States who define discipleship in terms of being covered in the dust of the master. And in the end, I was asked the question so often, I went off to discover where it came from and why it was important. You'll notice that I put 2 question marks on the end of it, because the jury's out for me on whether it's a good image or not. No, it's not. I think it's a great image, whether there's enough evidence for the image or not. The reason why it was really popular and it kind of really took on in certain circles is it's a brilliant image. I'll read you the quote from Rob Bell so you can see what I'm talking about the image. The idea of being covered in the dust of your rabbi came from something everybody had seen. A rabbi would come to town, and right behind him would be this group of students doing their best to keep up with the rabbi as he went about teaching his yoke from one place to another. By the end of a day of walking in the dirt directly behind their rabbi, the students would have the dust from his feet all over them, and that was a good thing. You can see why the image is a great one. It's a very vivid image, and you can see in your mind's eye, there's Jesus, the disciples are behind him, covered in the dust that he's flicked up while he's walking. The idea is that you are covered in kind of what comes off as the master walks off in front of you. And you can see that actually the image becomes a very affective one. But over the years, people kept on saying to me, well, where does it come from? What's the stories that give rise to this? And I spent ages trying to find it. I think I might have found the passage now. There may be others, and if anybody knows any other passages, then do come and tell me. But I think it comes from this passage in the Mishnah, Mishnah Avot 1 verse 4, which reads, "Let thy house be a meeting place for the sages," which would be another, you could always translate that as rabbis, "and sit amid the dust of their feet, and drink in their words with thirst." And sitting amidst the dust of their feet is probably where this lovely image was picked up with and then kind of expanded by people like Rob Bell and John Ortberg. The Hebrew for sitting amid literally means be powdering yourself with. So it might not mean sit, it might mean let your house be a meeting place for the sages and be powdering yourself with the dust of their feet. I think sit amid probably sounds slightly better, doesn't it? So the idea is therefore that you are attached to the dust that comes from the rabbi. When I said I was in two minds and ended up with my double question mark, I'm not sure whether that passage quite gives enough evidence to support the lovely story. I really like the lovely story, and I think the lovely story really works, but I don't think there's evidence to say really it comes from the Mishnah, but I leave it in your hands. You may decide that that powdering yourself with the dust of the master is sufficient for that. I think the interesting question is, do you need the rabbinic evidence for Rob Bell's story still to be true? Because actually that's what would have happened. And can we just imagine a what would have happened scenario for it to work? So I'm leaving it up on my list as a disciple is question. Is a disciple covered in the dust of their master? They certainly live around with their master, and there's some great passages in the Talmud about a real student. A real student goes to, and I can't even remember the exact, I read this in an American book, so it's an American translation. Bearing in mind this is from the Talmud, a real student of the master goes to the bathroom with the master. I don't know what the Hebrew is, but the implication is you follow them everywhere and you see everything that they do. And in other places they say a real student of the master goes into the bedroom of the master, and you kind of go, it doesn't really translate into a 21st century context, but you get the idea. That actually a real student is someone who spends the entirety of their time with Jesus. And actually one of the things we might want to add on to our list there is the phrase that I used earlier. A real disciple is someone who knocks about with Jesus, who just spends time in the company of Jesus. Covered with dust or not, the point is still the same. They spend time in the company of Jesus. And for me, one of the real challenges about discipleship and discerning discipleship and becoming people who are good at discerning good discipleship is actually, how do we help people today to knock about in the company of Jesus? How do we do that? I think one of the real dangers of discipleship is that what we do is we train people into church rather than into spending time in the company of Jesus. Again, I was at a conference a while ago and somebody asked a very kind of resonating question to me, which was that when I became a Christian, he said, I was invited to join the family of God. And I went to join the family of God and all I got was meetings. And it seems, again, to be a very kind of striking and kind of challenging question, is when we are introducing people to the life of discipleship, how can we be sure that the master that they're following is truly Jesus and not us? Truly Jesus and not other Christians. Truly Jesus and not the life of the church. One of the things I always am tempted to say when I hear conversations going on is, you do know that the reason I'm a Christian is not other Christians. I mean, there's nothing wrong with you, most of you, you understand. But the point is that we don't say, come and join this attractive, wonderful group of people. It'll be so lovely. You'll have such a great time. That's not the point. The point, of course, is that we're following the Master. And we need to help people to understand the following of the Master. So, from the world of the first century, therefore, we have a certain list of things that we can understand about what they thought a disciple was. I'll pick up the speed a little bit so we've still got time for a conversation at the end. What I want to do now is to reflect on how Jesus changes some of that model. There are some interesting things to observe there. The first thing to observe, and this is said in a lot of books about discipleship, is that the difference between Jesus' discipleship and most other discipleship is most other discipleship you chose a rabbi. The idea would be, it'd be kind of like choosing a school today. You would look around and you go, that one, I think that one's a really good rabbi, and off you'd go to that rabbi. The rabbi wouldn't choose you, you would choose him. And one of the really striking things, of course, as we all know about Jesus, is Jesus called his disciples. Except for when he didn't. And I just want to put a little rider in for the except for when he didn't. Most of the time he called his disciples. But Luke 9 is a really interesting example, because you've got 3 discipleship candidates in Luke 9. And just notice the different dynamic of what goes on, because I think they're quite interesting. You have the first one, where someone says, I will follow you wherever you go. The implication of the context is that's his idea. He's selected Jesus and said, I will follow you. And then in verse 59, you have another one where Jesus said, follow me. And then he says a few excuses first. And then you're back to 61, I will follow you, Lord. It's an interesting question about whether they were asked first or whether they just followed first. But I think it is nevertheless worth observing that, well, skip over that and get at this point, that they were called by Jesus, or at least most were called by Jesus. Some weren't, but most seem to have been called by Jesus. And there is something I think very, very significant about the recognition of the nature of discipleship, which is about hearing and responding to the call of Jesus. It's not a good idea. You don't just sit down and kind of work out your formulae on a piece of paper and go, at the end of the day, logically, I've worked all the way through. I think the best thing to do with my life is follow Jesus. There may be some people who do that, but in my experience, the vast majority of people are just called inexorably by the person of Jesus. Jesus still calls today, come, follow me. And the reason we follow is not because it's a good idea, but just because we've got to. We have no choice about it. I'm regularly asked by people, why on earth do you do the kind of things that you do? The answer is because I've got to. I haven't got a choice about it. I am held in that most loving, masterful grip of Jesus. I have no choice but to follow. And I think one of the really challenging things for all of us is that question of how do we allow the voice of Jesus to speak again, to speak clearly so that people can hear and follow. The other really interesting element about following Jesus is, of course, the fact that we are called to commitment. Go back to Luke 9. You will see immediately from Luke 9 that actually Jesus has a very high bar of expectation of what it means. And this is a really interesting question, because if you compare Jesus to the other rabbis of the first century, the other rabbis of the first century seem to have a much lower bar of expectation of commitment, which is that you did it for a while and then you stopped. There's various different models about how long people would follow a rabbi for, but somewhere between 2 and 6 years. Of course, the big difference between Jesus's rabbiship and other people's rabbiship is simply that Jesus expects a lifetime. It doesn't go, I'll have you for 18 months and then you can go off and do your own thing. And there is something profoundly unfashionable and therefore profoundly challenging for us to be very clear about. This is a commitment. My daughter and I were having conversations about commitment yesterday because she had started doing something and hadn't really fancied carrying on, and we had this conversation about the nature of commitment and the importance of commitment. And it's a really striking one, isn't it? It's actually, how do we begin to communicate something about the lifelong commitmentness of discipleship to Jesus? I think is another one of the challenges when we're thinking about the nature of discipleship. Stephen's already said this, but again, it's worth reminding ourselves, is that stitched into the heart of discipleship, and what makes discipleship of Jesus radically different from all other discipleships that were going on in the first century, is that within the discipleship of Jesus is stitched in the expectation of proclamation. And I don't think I can say this strongly enough, actually. There are no other rabbi discipleship relationships that went on in the first century that had any expectation of you going out to proclaim anything. The whole point about being in a relationship with a rabbi was you did it for your own benefit, or possibly for his benefit, but not for anybody else's benefit. You would learn, and what you learnt was what you learnt, and then you might talk to other people, but you never were sent out to proclaim it. I think one of the really striking and very important elements about Jesus' call to discipleship is that it is about learning and proclamation. You learn through following and then you proclaim. And there seems to be something, I think, really vitally important to stop and think about the radical nature of what that would have felt like in the first century. I think people in the first century would have simply been bemused about the fact that actually Jesus is saying, come follow me, now go. I know there's another example. So we've got Mark 1:17, I will make you fish for people, and the Luke 9 that we've seen already. Let the dead bury their dead, but as for you, go and proclaim the kingdom of God. The very first thing that this unnamed disciple is sent to do is to proclaim, not to learn first. And there's various things I think are worth just kind of pausing and thinking about there. Back to learning. We are, as I've established, not a particularly good learning environment, except for when it avoids us doing something. Then we're really good at learning. I don't know if you've noticed how much, even you have that inner urge. You know, somebody asks you to do something, you say, well, can you train me first? I'll just go on a little course. And once I've done the course and I've got my certificate, then I'll go on the next course. And once I've finished that course, then I'll probably go on another course. I'm a lifelong student, so I'm one of the worst of these. But one of the really striking things about the dynamic with Jesus is that Jesus sends people out to proclaim before I think they're ready. You know, if I had been on the panel that went, do we allow these disciples out to proclaim the kingdom? I would have said, definitely not ready. Certainly not this one. He's not even knocked around with Jesus yet. He's just said, Jesus said, follow me. And then he says, go and proclaim. And he goes, wait. He's got to learn something first. Apparently not. And one of the really striking things you'll see from tomorrow is tomorrow we're going to have a look at 3 passages from Mark, 4, 6 and 8. They are kind of glorious passages because they're the passages which tell you how the disciples don't get Jesus. They miss him and then they miss him again and then they miss him again. And Mark 4, they're all boat scenes. And in Mark 6, just after the disciples had spectacularly misunderstood everything about who Jesus was, Jesus sent them out to proclaim the kingdom. And you go, are you stark staring mad? We've just established they don't know who you are. How can they go out and proclaim the kingdom? The point is that discipleship is about proclaiming the kingdom. You become a disciple by proclaiming. It's not that you need to know it all first. Of course you need to do your ongoing. The ongoing learning goes on all the way through your life as a disciple, and you come back and you learn some more and you learn some more. But woven within that is an expectation of proclamation. And having just finished the Pilgrim course, I rather hesitate to say this, but I just wonder actually whether a discipleship course really should be the very first thing that you do is go and proclaim, and then we'll talk a little bit more about content. And what would it look like and what would it feel like if actually that was our expectation, is that the first thing you do is you go and proclaim. probably would see everyone running for the hills, but it is quite an interesting model to say, well, actually, what if we stitch proclamation so much into our understanding of learning and following of Jesus? So, call to commitment, sent to proclaim. Quickly on the cost of discipleship. The other thing that we all know, which is a really very significant thing, is that discipleship is about cost. There is a huge expectation of Jesus to his disciples is that they will bear the cost of discipleship just as Jesus bears the cost of his discipleship. It is worth just being clear about what we mean about this. This is so often when we're talking about things that are true that you can just turn the focus slightly wrongly and get the wrong end of the stick. So let's just be clear about what we're not saying before we're clear about what we are saying. Jesus does not call us to be miserable. We don't, by the cost of discipleship, mean the call to be miserable always under all circumstances. One of my most hated hymns, for personal reasons really, is the Father, hear the prayer we offer, not for ease that prayer will be. You want to go, yeah, but ease isn't a bad thing automatically. The call to cost is not that you are automatically called to be miserable always. The call to cost is actually summed up beautifully in Matthew 16 and Luke 9. Let them deny themselves and take up their cross daily in Luke 9. And what it means in that particular context, and then you might be interested to know that the Greek word for let them deny themselves, well, the deny is easy, but the themselves bit has the word psyche in, which you might sometimes translate as soul. Let you deny the very thing about who you are. And what it's talking about there is that as people, our human nature is absolutely programmed to defend yourself, to place yourself at the center of everything, to make sure that you and your small group of family or your larger group of family are defended against everybody else. The point about the call to the cost of discipleship is to take yourself out of the center of your life and you place Christ in the center of your life instead. And the reason why that is a radical call is because if you place Christ in the center of yourself, you must be open to the possibility that that will mean that you have to have the end fate that Jesus had. It might not. You're not meant to rush into disaster all the time. There are some kind of the early church fathers who kind of got this message slightly too clearly, I think, who were going, bring it on, I'm going to die any moment, death coming my way. That's misunderstanding the point of the cost of the discipleship. The cost of discipleship is the most painful thing possible, which is to take yourself out of the middle of who you are and put Christ in instead. That might mean that you have a very, very difficult life. It might not. It's not about the difficulty. It's about, well, the difficulty is the taking yourself out of the center. The rest is not necessarily predicated on it all. So, we're sent to proclaim. We're expected to bear the cost of disciples. And just to make the point again, but it is a really important one, and we are sent to make more disciples. It's slightly different from proclaiming. Earlier on in the Gospels, they're sent to proclaim that the kingdom is near. At the end of Matthew 28, which, as you all know, the point that Jesus makes is that he is going to send them to make more disciples. Now, no rabbi ever did that in the first century. You wouldn't do that. The point is that this rabbi teaches these disciples. That's the connection that goes on. And when these disciples are done, a new batch come in and he teaches these disciples. You don't send your disciples out to make more disciples. What Jesus did was completely revolutionize the model of rabbi to disciple, which was that his first disciples went to make more disciples. But where that is completely different from the rabbinic system is that in the rabbinic system, so for example, Gamaliel was a pupil of, I forget which one it was, I think it was Shammai. So Rabbi Shammai trained Gamaliel, and then Gamaliel trained Paul, and then they trained, but you would be the pupil of that rabbi. The point of what Jesus is saying here is that you send out the disciples, but the master stays the same. I don't become the rabbi because I'm making disciples. Jesus remains the rabbi. You're just passing on the discipleship. So you'd have the same master, though different disciples, but passing it on. And there is actually something really, really important about the recognition that Jesus' discipleship is about the passing it on. It's about the making more disciples. Before I end, I just want to make one final point about Matthew 28, and then we'll kind of go back to the list and see what we've learned so far about the nature of discipleship. I have a little bugbear about Matthew 28, and it's the word go. I really dislike the word go in Matthew 28. The Greek word is poreuomai, which means to travel. It doesn't have go in it at all. And the trouble is, if you say go, like if I were to stand here and say go, then the implication would be, you're not to, incidentally, that you would all get up and go and I would stay here. That's the implication of the word go. I'm here, you're gone, and off you've gone. But actually, to translate it like that is completely to misunderstand Matthew 28, because you have to read to the end, where it says, I am with you always. It should really be translated as come, not go. Jesus is going outwards now to the whole of the world. He's not saying, off you go. I'm not sure how you're going to fare. Come back and tell me later on whether you've done a good job or not. What Jesus says is, now let us all go together to the ends of the world. And I am with you always. The reason why this relationship of making disciples works in the case of Jesus is because Jesus comes with us. Of course, Jesus comes with us, but it is a vital element to the understanding of the master-disciple relationship. So, what therefore have we learned about disciples? I can't put the other screen up because it's too far away, but just to summarise, and then we can begin some conversation. Discipleship was both profoundly familiar in the first century and profoundly unfamiliar. In the sense that it's profoundly familiar in that they recognised the essence of the relationship between the master and a disciple. But what Jesus did was take an actual relationship and turn it on its head. He brought in some radically new understandings of what it means to be a disciple. He calls people. He doesn't wait for them to choose them by himself. He calls people into commitment. He sends them into proclamation. He expects them to bear the cost. He sends them out to make more disciples. That list could go on and on. It's not exhaustive, but it just gives you a sense of the way in which Jesus uses the model and then changes the model. So my question, I think, that we can bounce outwards now into conversation together, is actually how do we use this image, and I'm now going to use the word image, because it was a real relationship in the first century. They knew what a master and disciple relationship was. I am absolutely committed to keeping the master-disciple relationship as our primary image for talking about Jesus. But how do we now use it in the 21st century in a way that makes sense, in a way that actually resonates with people, in a way that actually has some meaning to it? The people who are very critical of the language of discipleship are those who are saying, well, it doesn't make any sense anymore. To which I always want to say, well, let's make it make sense then, and then it will make sense and it'll be all right. But actually, how do we make it make sense? What do we need when we're talking about the nature of discipleship to put in place so that it begins to make sense? There may be all sorts of other things that you want to talk about as well. We've got 6 o'clock is when we absolutely end, but we can end before that if we have run out of energy and steam. Can I suggest that you turn to your neighbour for a while and just begin to explore some ideas about what do you think we need to think about in terms of discipleship? How do we make it make sense in the 21st century? And then we'll have a conversation together and see where we get to. We've got 2 microphones. This is going to be something of a challenge given the room layout. Your entertainment for the afternoon is watching the people with the microphones wending their way to the people who want to speak. And if you want to have great enjoyment, I always think the best thing to do is have someone at the front and then someone right at the back, because then they've got to run if they can. Anyway, anyone got any comments, observations? And incidentally, if you want to disagree with me as well, that's absolutely fine. Oh, we've got someone right down here already following my adage.
Oh, I got a wend now, haven't I?
And is there anybody else who wants to line themselves up for microphone number 2? There we go. And then we'll go to you 3 after.
You were saying about Paul and discipleship.
Yes.
Paul said, I am an apostle, the least of all the apostles. So there's a reference there for the fact that Paul did think that he was an apostle. Well, as for the dust, when you leave a town, shake the dust off your feet. Yeah,
absolutely. There was lots of dust in the first, dust was not an issue in first century Palestine, bags of dust. And that's, in a way, the reason why the image works is, of course, they would have been covered in dust. It's whether there was kind of a rabbinic background for it. The stuff on the apostle is a really good thing to raise, I think. I think sometimes we are slightly too pedantic. I love being pedantic, but sometimes we're slightly too pedantic about the words, about our words, because we try and make a very big distinction sometimes between apostle and disciple. And as I'm just trying to establish, actually, we are all called to be apostolic disciples, because the first thing Jesus says is go, or come, depending on which way you want to look at it. But the point is that we are people who are an essential part of discipleship is being sent. So the apostolic discipleship element, which is why often people talk about missionary disciples these days. So yes, Paul uses the apostle word, though not the disciple word, which is just a really interesting thing to observe. And again, why that is, hard to say, but really interesting to notice that he kind of picks up one of them. Now
I suppose I was just thinking about the process of training, training ordained public ministers, training lay colleagues, training that we provide perhaps in parishes as well to equip people to do work, that we quickly fall into that pattern of saying there is a series of learning objectives, the things people must know in order to go out and do these things. Whereas if we take that pattern of discipleship that you've laid out for us seriously, then the more fundamentally important part of all that is what I would understand from my theological college background is formation. It's the knocking around with Jesus stuff and being able to talk about these things in that context that enables you to go out and do that with others later on.
Absolutely.
I'm very struck by that.
And it constantly strikes me that we have the things the wrong way round often. The other thing that I'm really intrigued about Matthew 28, and this might, in fact, actually, can we just go back to the screen, to my screen? And I'm always slightly hesitant to say this, but it is really striking in Matthew 28 that Jesus gets it the wrong way round. Or does he? Because he says, go and make disciples, which is the main verb, doing 2 things, baptizing them and teaching them. And you want to go, surely it should be teaching and then baptizing. And it might be entirely coincidental. It might not be chronological. It might just say, go and make disciples, and there's 2 things that you do, baptizing and teaching all at the same time. It's just very striking that it's the wrong way round. And I just wonder whether often we do get things the wrong way round. We just want to do you know this, do you know that, do you know the other, whereas actually the really important thing is, tell me about your encounter with Jesus and the rest will fall into place. Thank you.
Paula, thank you very much. I really appreciated your focus on learning, and also that it's not learning as in just transfer of information. However, part of me is thinking about the cultural difference between Jesus' time and Jesus' followers, learners, and ours, which is, of course, they had a shared foundation, if you like, in Torah, and in a particular way of seeing the world in which Yahweh was central, all that sort of stuff, which we, of course, can't assume. And so there is the whole question of how that is learnt and how that comes into the mix.
Absolutely, and I couldn't agree more. One of the biggest problems we've got for understanding the New Testament, let alone anything else, is that the New Testament writers know your Old Testament in Hebrew and Greek, and therefore they put all their little allusions in. And I think one of the real challenges is actually how do we become people who can really engage in the way that they did. And I think what I'm trying to do is swing a pendulum, and what happens when you swing a pendulum is you always kind of go too far in it. teaching is really important to me. Teaching the Bible is really important to me. Teaching facts is really important to me. This is an essential part, and it was also essential to Jesus. It's what the Sermon on the Mount is for. What I'm just trying to do is to say it is really, really important, but we cannot for a moment think we've done it when we have taught people everything that they need to know whenever that moment comes. But actually, if we communicate all the truths of the gospel, they're not necessarily a disciple if they're not knocking around with Jesus. And it's that I'm trying to push. But thank you for picking it up, because it is a really important thing to say in swinging the pendulum. Let's not lose the really important stuff. Oh, great. I'm working on the principle that you're finding the people for me while I'm talking. Lovely.
Paula, I really enjoyed your talk, and especially what you said about discipleship being key, this relationship with Christ in our life. But I think what's important sometimes is to not make this dichotomy between the church and Christ himself. And actually, when we look at, say, discipleship in the early church, this idea of mystagogy, to enter into the life of Christ through the church. And sometimes if we just see the church as a practical vehicle for training and Jesus as this mystical figure who we have a relationship with, we lose that sense that it's through the church that we enter into this relationship with Christ, that we become disciples. And although the church is messed up and is a pretty difficult institution to deal with at times, it is still fundamentally and truthfully the body of Christ, the agent through which we become disciples.
Thank you. Yeah, again, really important corrective. I couldn't agree with you more, and one of my great passions is the kind of the corporate language in Paul and the body of Christ and the significance of that, and the experiential change that happens when you become a part of that mystical body of Christ. Absolutely with you. I think the danger, do you know, I just hate the word church. I'll come out and be honest. I loathe the word church, because the word church comes with such a baggage. As soon as you said body of Christ, I'm with you all the way. The trouble is the word church comes with such a baggage of stuff that I really struggle. This is my prejudice, so feel an entire permission to disagree with me. But I think there is something about, if the word church, and maybe I've just been on General Synod for too long, but you know, the word church says to me all the stuff that I can't do, and all the stuff that kind of must be kind of factored out, and hours of debates, and hours of kind of, and not actually that mystagogical, that kind of mystical encounter with Christ. So maybe that's just me. Maybe it's just my own inner prejudice. But I think there is something about trying to recognise that constant being brought back to the faithfulness of Christ. And of course we encounter Christ through the body of Christ. And how that happens. And, you know, if that happens in a PCC meeting, absolutely fabulous. But does it, I suppose, is the question. But thank you. I do agree. I'm just thinking out loud.
I'm intrigued by you talking about teaching and learning, and talking about learning the way that we teach. Being involved as a governor in a local school, Ofsted now judge a lesson not as good if it's well taught, but if people have actually learned, the students have actually learned. And I just find myself wondering if that same thing was applied in some of our churches and some of our groups and some of our sermons, how outstanding would some of our teaching be when actually people aren't learning? And I'm just intrigued that that's the way it's going.
I'm just going to leave that hanging, because I think that's enormously challenging. And how do we test the learning? How do we test? Because of course it's the learning, in a way the Ofsted is much easier to do, because there's stuff that you're meant to know, that you're meant to have learned. What we're meant to learn is Jesus. How do you test whether we're learning Jesus? You know, that kind of Ephesians quote, learning Christ. And so, but thank you, very, very, very powerful. Oh, I've got two. Who was first?
I think you're next. Yeah, go on.
No, you go first. Go first. Go. You've got the mic. You're holding the microphone.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
There is one question I'd love to ask you, but I'm going to ask it, but then you might wish to defer it.
Excellent.
Okay.
I like it when people.
In which case, I've got a more fluent second question. But the first question I want to ask you is, if you were guiding someone to learn from Rabbi Jesus, okay, and they ask you a question about destiny, how do you think Rabbi Jesus would answer the question, what was Judas's destiny? The reason I'm asking you this question is you've opened a paradigm of discipleship. Now, my context is just having done a service for a suicide in a penal institution, and we did it in front of the cell. And the question was asked by a prisoner, not a flippant question, but he's wanting to know what's happened to a guy that was hanging in cell because he helped cut him down. Where's he gone? Because he's committed a sin, you know. So how would Rabbi Jesus approach, do you think, that question about destiny? How would he teach that? How would he open that question? If you want to defer it,
interestingly, your question became the different question that I thought it was when you started asking it. So I'm going to answer what I thought you were going to say, what I thought you were asking first, and then I'll answer the second bit. What I thought you were asking first was about Judas and what he did, and Judas Is Sin. Yeah. And because my view is that Judas's sin was not waiting to be forgiven. His real, I mean, of course his sin was betraying Jesus, but, you know, Peter betrayed Jesus, and you could argue that Peter betrayed Jesus in a more powerful way emotionally, because in Luke's Gospel, Peter looked him in the eye while he was betraying Jesus. In Luke's Gospel, Jesus is there in the courtyard while he does it. But the difference is that Judas gave up and Peter didn't. So that would be one thing. On the suicide question, I think that it would be a very, I think what Rabbi Jesus would do, whenever Rabbi Jesus was asked a really hard question, he asked another question back.
It was the method.
Yes.
The rabbi would
yes.
use that.
Well, I don't know if you've noticed all the way through the Gospels, the really tough questions, he always answers with a question, every single time. And so, in a sense, the question then would be, so tell me what you think. And then you're off the hook.
That is a method of teaching.
It is an absolute method of teaching, and it's one of the best methods of teaching, the asking questions.
It's just applicable.
Yeah.
In that sense.
Where are we going now? Oh, we're going here. And I do see various hands. I'm hoping you're seeing them too.
I was just reflecting on the asking questions and how fundamental and exciting it is. Because if you think about the group of people who have to learn the most as quickly as possible are youngest children who have to learn an incredible amount of information, and they ask questions and ask questions and ask questions. And similarly, in a church learning group, the people who are most valuable in that group are the people who come who apparently don't know very much, but ask the best questions that really help us all to learn.
Yes, absolutely. And it is, I mean, I couldn't agree more. It is that one of the things that always makes me sad is how we knock curiosity out of children. You know, will you stop asking why? You know, I've said it's mine. But why? Just because. But actually, that question why is so vital, isn't it, for our learning and our well-being and our growing. And, you know, maybe on our list needs to be people who are really good at asking why.
The thing that really struck me was hitting the nail on the head, which is about relationship with Jesus. Yeah. And just 3 weeks ago, somebody came to faith in our church because they'd seen the beauty of Jesus in somebody else, and that was highly attractive to her. And a friend who'd just come to faith was being baptized, and she shared her testimony before that, and the proclamation of her testimony, just saying, this is what Jesus has done for me. She didn't know anything about the Bible or anything at this stage, but her testimony was so powerful. The woman who heard it came to faith that Sunday. She was baptized actually this Sunday, so that's within 3 weeks. But both those people are hungry for more of Jesus, and actually helping them to experience more of him is what strikes me as discipleship's really all about. But there comes a point where the experience requires explanation. And the explanation, we've adopted the system that you're talking about. If somebody has a question, and say, well, what do you think about that? And actually refusing to answer the question for quite some time, and then actually going to Scripture with them, and actually how the Holy Spirit reveals truth. And there comes a point where you need to give some measure of explanation, but helping them to ask the questions, it strikes me as being a very significant point in their journey when they discover something for themselves looking at Scripture.
Thank you, very helpful. I think Bishop seems articulating out there we need to finish. So let us pause. We have a whole morning tomorrow and loads of time for questions. So hold the thought and we can come back to them tomorrow if you've got them.